Good afternoon. Happy Friday. In this week's negotiation nugget, I'm going to talk about 5 reasons you need a behavioural strategy when negotiating with your suppliers. Now, when it comes to negotiation, it is very common that teams focus on the process of what is the proposal about, how are we going to make the ask, what might the other party come back with, and how are we going to respond. But it's often not in the sense where we're focused on our behaviors, but more around the action of negotiating and the deal itself. Now, in this 15-minute or just under negotiation nugget, I want to talk about why a behavioural strategy when negotiating with your suppliers is going to be critical and where the value is in having one. So if I just bring up my screen, there we go. The first one is all about understanding supplier behaviour. If you have a well-crafted behavioural strategy, it's going to actually help you build a better understanding of your supplier's behavior. In having that understanding, you better understand their motivations, their decision-making process, and understanding other factors that can influence the negotiation. And when you have this knowledge, you can create a negotiation plan that is more likely to be successful. When you understand behavior and therefore how they make decisions, it leaves us not focusing on the what, but it gets us underneath their positions and helps us better understand their interests. Because too often, what people are expressing in their behaviors and what we see are driven from a set of emotions underneath the surface that we don't see. And by understanding our supplier behavior, by building a pattern of insights and information from our previous interactions, we can then determine how best we can calibrate that information into a strategy that then we can use to build on that behavior in a negotiation. As we get into the second one, there we go, let me just move the slides around. It's about building supplier relationships. Now, in a value creation scenario where it's all about how do we grow the prize and how do we get more value from the deals with our partners, people that we're working with for a long period of time, we need to build relationships. If we have a behavioral strategy, it can help us build those crucial relationships with suppliers by understanding behavior that they present, but also not only theirs, ours. We can identify areas where trust is either built or trust is lost. And if we understand where trust is built and where trust is lost in the behaviors they present, in the behaviors we present, we can then work effectively to create partnership by identifying the behaviors that are conducive to collaboration, conducive to creating value, not just distributing value. And the way you can then craft more future focused deals, better deals in the relationship that you have with your supplier can create a more positive business environment also. By understanding our own behavioral strategy when it comes to building relationships, we've got far more insight and intelligence that then allows us to build trust. And when trust is built, the opportunity for taking those risks and doing things that partnerships wouldn't otherwise do in the absence of trust, again, looks for opportunity to create value. The third area that if you are focused on building a behavioral strategy, you can better manage conflict. Now, as we know, with most negotiations with suppliers can lead to conflict, especially in an environment that we've experienced now where there's significant price pressure and cost pressure. And that in itself can cause tension. When we're talking about price, it often ends up being a value distributive conversation, not necessarily one that's all about value creation. But by understanding the other party's behaviors and creating a strategy of our own, we can identify potential areas of disagreement in advance and create the appropriate strategies to address them. And when we do that, we can avoid disputes that can ultimately negatively impact our business relationship with that supplier. When we don't identify those potential areas of disagreement in advance, it's easy in a negotiation to get caught by the emotions that you're feeling and lead to that tension where emotions ride high and behavior is compromised as a result. But when you have a strategy around your behavior, you're expecting that tension, you're expecting the potential for that tension to cause conflict. And what you can do is create a forethought plan around how you're going to navigate that. Expect that tension, and then your reaction and the behavior to that can be best managed. In terms of the fourth point, let me bring that up. It's about finding common ground. When we have a clear behavioral strategy with our suppliers, we can have a clearly identified, mutually beneficial agreement that works for both parties, because we're looking for where the common ground is. By understanding their behaviors and seeing how they respond to certain proposals, certain asks, we can anticipate what areas they might need us to make concessions and where solutions need to be found that can benefit both parties. But again, if we don't have a strategy around our behavior to look for common ground, to avoid us reacting in a way to new information in that moment, as opposed to anticipating potential new information and managing our dialogue and our composure and the way we are portraying our behaviors through managing our emotions, we're not necessarily calibrating to what the negotiation needs. And therefore, the opportunity to find common ground can be impacted as a result. The fifth and final point in why you need a behavioral strategy is also ultimately about improving negotiation outcomes. You can't improve outcomes in a negotiation unless you understand your counterparty. Understanding your supplier allows you to create more effective plans and solutions that are more efficient and more effective, that align to not only your goals, but their goals also. And too often we're focused on our interests, too often we're focused on just the tactical elements of the deal itself, what proposal we're going to present first, what proposal we're going to present second, how will we counter, but not necessarily how in the behavior. It's usually how are we going to counter with the what, what is our next proposal, what is our third proposal and fourth, etc. But what we're not looking to do is to examine and prepare our behaviors to the potential dynamics that might be presented to us from our counterparty. So when you're thinking about behavioral strategy, I want you to think about, are you leveraging it to understand your supplier behavior? Do you make effective notes in the negotiation that gives you information not just only on the proposals that you're receiving from them, but the way they delivered them, how they behaved, what they shared, what information did you get from their behaviors that indicated what was important to them? If you can understand their behaviors and validate that with information you've got about the proposal, you can start to build a very clear picture and profile about your supplier. Also, when you're looking at how you're building relationships, how are you currently looking at the way trust is established? Do you know the way your suppliers build trust? And are you leveraging the way you're building relationships that supports that trust being built so that you can get the best outcome in the long run, so that there's a future deal to be had, so that the dialogue is open and there is an opportunity to share and discuss and focus on where value can be created for the overall prize for both parties. And when you're thinking about managing conflict, are you thinking about where is the tension going to be in our proposal? How might they react? Am I ready for the way they might react? If something's very difficult, if it's a price increase, if it's a reduction in purchasing, if there's a reduction in space, or there's a challenge that you have, particularly addressing that supplier's service or product delivery, you need to think about how you're going to expect the other party to respond to what you're saying. Now, too often we're preparing our delivery of tough news or areas where there may be conflict, and we're not anticipating how the other party is going to react. And when we don't do that, when we don't think about how we're going to manage conflict or how we're going to respond to someone getting frustrated, irate, potentially combative in a negotiation, without a behavioural strategy, we're not going to be able to manage that tension appropriately, effectively, where we can keep our emotions at bay and ultimately then deliver value in a way that's going to be receptive for the other party. And as we move around to common ground, again, the behavioural strategy there is, am I even looking for where the interests that we have align? Am I too focused on what our interests are? Have I considered what their interests are? And has their behaviours already told me where the common interests are? Are there clues in the way they're acting, the way they're speaking, what they're sharing, how they're leaning in or leaning out from conversations that gives me an understanding of where common ground can be found? And finally, am I looking at how their behaviors supports me getting a better outcome for my business? Am I looking at the opportunities where I can show them through my behaviors, through the way I've managed the situation, the way I've controlled the negotiation, the way I've controlled my behaviors, all in service of the end outcome? Now, I can't identify for you enough how important this is. Don't just focus on what it is that you want from the other party. Don't just focus on what your proposals are and what your counter proposals are going to be. Spend the time, leverage understanding their behaviors, because you can achieve a significant amount more in your negotiations if you have a strategy on how to behave and how to respond to the behavior of the other party, and how to leverage the behavior that they present in terms of intelligence and movement in your negotiations. So thanks very much for listening this week. I'll be back again next week with another negotiation nugget.